Thank you. It's great to be here, and it's good to see so many young people interested in philosophy. This is very gratifying for me. Yes, I come from University of Turku, and I specialize in animal and environmental ethics. And in recent years, I have been focusing particularly on moral psychology and how that influences our moral relationship and attitudes and beliefs concerning non-human animals and nature. And today I will be speaking on the topic, the need for multi-species democracy. And I will first show some of my books. These are in English. So if you are interested in this topic, you can have a look at these. They're widely available. And one of them was co-edited with John Hadley, so Animal Ethics and Philosophy is a collection of essays, and the other two are monographies. So if this topic interests you, I recommend these books, even if I say so myself. You can also find my peer-reviewed articles on my website, which you can find under my name. So I have listed all the articles that I have published on these topics there. And then these are two books, most recent books in philosophy in Finnish, if there are any Finnish students here, which I'm sure that there are some. So if you want to have a look, browse these books. They are essays, so essay collections on animal philosophy. But I will begin this talk on the notion of anthropocentrism. How many are familiar with this concept? Please raise your hand. How many are familiar with animal ethics? So? Some are? Yes? Okay, that's good, because I don't want to speak to an audience who knows everything already. So this is a good thing. But first, anthropocentrism. There's a very long history of dualism in Western philosophy, which has tended to think that category distinctions between different species leads to categorical divides. Now, I argue that this is, and many others argue that this is a logical fallacy, simply because we have distinct species which have different qualities does not mean that only human beings out of the millions of other species are their own category, which categorically, absolutely, is separate from the rest of the animal world. But unfortunately, in Western philosophy, this logical mistake has been repeated time and again since ancient philosophy and up until even contemporary philosophy. So there's a long history of arguing that human beings differ categorically from the rest of the animal world, that there's nothing that actually brings us together. Now, when it comes to the history of this belief, it has some obvious influences from the Judeo-Christian tradition, which argues that human beings are images of God. And of course, it stems partly from Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas and other such thinkers. But the categorical distinction still remains one of the most illogical and yet common understandings of animals in philosophy. It has led to the idea that there is a self-evident value hierarchy between humans and other animals. It has led to the belief in human moral supremacy, the idea that humans are on top of the natural world, and thereby also justified to use other animals in whichever instrumental means they wish to. So the value of non-human animals has often been reduced into a merely instrumental value, or at best indirect value. Philosophers such as Thomas Aquinas and Immanuel Kant and René Descartes are famous examples of thinkers who believed that animals, first of all, are categorically distinct from human beings, and secondly, human beings are allowed to use animals instrumentally in whatever way they want to. And this has paved the way for a heavily anthropocentric culture in which the instrumentalism and instrumental value of other animals is seen as an ad hoc justification and basis for the ontological claim of dualism. And this is another logical problem with this belief, because it leads to circularity. Often, first, the instrumental value of non-human animals is justified on account that animals differ categorically from human beings. Secondly, this then leads to the notion of instrumental value, which again is used to justify the idea that animals indeed are categorically separate from human beings. Current empirical studies done in psychology show that most human beings rate or downrate the mental and psychological and cognitive abilities of those animals they instrumentalize the most. So if you happen to eat a lot of bacon, you will downgrade the cognitive abilities of pigs, for instance. And this shows that this circularity, the problem of circularity, is common in culture. We want to find justifications for using animals extensively, and this, in my belief, is a problem. Now, of course, there have also been pro-animal views in Western philosophy. The minds and value of non-human animals have been topics of Western philosophy from the beginning. For instance, Pythagoras, Plutarch, and Theophrastus are famous names who have spoken of the moral value of non-human animals and also of their mental abilities. Plutarch, for instance, whose book, the Finnish translation of it, one of the books or writings is here, is particularly colorful in his language, how he describes the minds of other animals and also the moral problems in eating, for instance, meat. So this is interesting. We have big names from the ancient times who did consider the moral value of other animals and also their cognitive abilities. And this is the case also during modernity. So for instance, David Hume in length spoke of the mental abilities of other animals. He underscored the fact that, of course, also animals are intelligent beings who have concepts, beliefs, and emotions. Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill are two quite famous examples of this concern for non-human animals. They are philosophers who argue that we have much more stringent duties towards animals than is traditionally believed. Jean-Jacques Rousseau spoke of other animals quite extensively. The list is long. I could list many others here. Arthur Schopenhauer and other such thinkers emphasized that we need to rethink anthropocentrism and treat other animals better. As I said, Jeremy Bentham is particularly famous in this context because he came up with this quote, which since it was first presented has become a classic in animal ethics. The quote goes, "The question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but rather can they suffer? Why should the law refuse its protection to any sensitive being?" How many of you have heard this quote before? Excellent. I would say maybe 40%. This is excellent, yes. This quote, presented in the context of utilitarianism, represents a big step in the Western philosophy's attitudes towards other animals. Suddenly, it was no longer species per se, which was deemed to be a sufficient justification to exclude other animals from moral consideration, but rather sentience, the ability to feel, became prominent. So therefore, Bentham and many others started to argue that we cannot exclude other animals on the basis of the presumed lack of human-like intelligence, but we rather must pay attention to their ability to feel, their ability to suffer. And this is a pivotal moment in Western philosophy. Suddenly, our attitudes towards other animals began to change quite drastically and radically. The background for raising moral concern in contemporary era is based on growing evidence of animal minds. The old idea, which was advocated and introduced by René Descartes, which understood animals to be purely mechanical creatures, and which is often called mechanomorphia, as an opposite or antonym to anthropomorphism. Here animals are mechanized rather than humanized. So mechanomorphia was a very common idea and a way of describing animals, which stems partly from Descartes. It is often also called anthropodenial. For instance, in cognitive ethology that does research into animal minds, this term is often used, anthropodenial. Denial of human-like characteristics in other animals. Or dementalization. Psychology uses the word dementalization to refer to the same phenomena. Again, animals are seen as creatures who lack mental abilities and are more akin to mechanisms and automata than minded creatures. And as I said, René Descartes is a famous example of such a thinker who believed in mechanomorphism. He, for instance, justified vivisection on account that animals are automata. He called them automata. He used the word mechanism, machine, and automation when it comes to other animals in his letters, and also in Discourse on a Method. But this is nowadays contested because we understand in contemporary sciences that there is a misguided dichotomy between reason and biology at play here. So what used to be the belief was that if there is reason, there is no biology. That reason is something that exists separately from biological predetermined instincts and other traits, subconscious traits, for instance. Today, we know that this is not the case. Also, human beings are largely mechanical when it comes to biological traits. We do lots of things without thinking about it, without reasoning it. We have a whole lot of instincts and species-specific traits, which we simply follow as if mechanically. But this does not mean that we do not have reason or emotions or cognitive abilities or consciousness. Of course we do. And the same applies to non-human animals. Of course, they can be both instinctual and biological and still have reasoning abilities. And cognitive ethology, particularly since 1950s, started to show that mechanomorphism simply does not apply. There are groundbreaking results from thinkers such as Jane Goodall and Mark Bekoff, Marion Dawkins, Leslie Rogers, Jaak Panskep, and Frans de Waal, and many, many others, which manifest that mechanomorphism is blatantly mistaken. Descartes was wrong, utterly wrong in his ideas of non-human disabilities. Capacities widely spread in the animal world include consciousness or sentience, here defined in a phenomenal sense. Of course, there are many theories of what consciousness means, but often here it is defined in the phenomenal sense, meaning what is it like to exist? It refers to the ability to feel one's existence as something. Here, Thomas Nagel's famous paper called What is it like to be a bat acts as one of the stepping stones. And today, scientists argue that sentience and phenomenal consciousness is very widespread in the animal world. It includes at least all mammals and birds, but also many fishes, probably all fishes. Invertebrates are highly represented in this category today as well. Mollusks can have sentience. Octopuses are one example of a creature who is very far from human beings evolutionary, but still in an evolutionary sense, but still obviously exhibits sentience and consciousness. Intentional goal-oriented behavior is very common in the animal world, as are emotions. There are plenty of empirical, highly verified studies to prove all of this. Also, memory and learning are quite common in the animal world. Many animals, in fact, excel in memory when compared to human beings. Many birds can remember thousands of locations where they hid specific seeds for the winter in order to eat them later. I cannot even remember where my class is or where my mobile phone is in most cases. So animals can exceed human abilities in certain instances. Also, the use of concepts is present in the animal world. Even abstract concepts such as symmetry are proven to be something that many animals can learn. For instance, pigeons and rats learn such concepts quite quickly. And this is not a surprise. Concepts offer us tools with which to understand the world and navigate in it in a successful way. For a creature who can move freely and who needs to often move quite rapidly in order to escape, for instance, a predator, they need to conceptualize the world in order to be able to live here successfully. And this is what differentiates animals from plants, for instance. Formation of beliefs is also common in the animal world. It now seems embarrassing that philosophers used to contest this because there's now so much empirical proof of all of this. When philosophers contested this, they did so from their living rooms or their offices. They simply sat down and speculated. They made guesses. There were opinions that were not based in reality. And now we have empirical proof of many of the things that philosophers used to deny. And this is perhaps a lesson for philosophy in general. Communication is widespread in the animal world, as is even culture. If we understand culture to be a phenomenon where parents or older generation teach their young, given specific ways of, for instance, eating food or finding food that are not purely instinctual. Communication is interesting here because many animals can learn tens or even hundreds of human concepts quite easily and use them fluently in the research setting. And of course, animals communicate amongst themselves, and we can only guess how complex their communication systems are. So there is no reason for species arrogance anymore. In fact, we ought to be quite humble at the face of the animal world. There are so many unique traits there. And the research that's coming out is often quite mind-boggling. It's awe-astounding. Now, this has led the basis for animal ethics, which I asked you earlier, do you know about it? How many have read Peter Singer's Animal Liberation? Oh, some have. Excellent. Yes, excellent. So I will very briefly summarize one of his most famous arguments before we move on to democracy. Singer wrote the book Animal Liberation in 1975, and it represents what is called preference utilitarianism, and Singer is perhaps the most famous and well-known prominent advocate of preference utilitarianism. And simply stated, it refers to the idea that we ought to act so as to maximize the satisfaction of interests equally. So we ought to do acts and make decisions that maximize interest satisfaction. Interests, again, are something that Singer attaches to well-being and welfare. So the basis of interests is the capacity to have a well-being or a welfare, the capacity to literally fare better or worse. A tractor cannot have interests. A painting doesn't have an interest, even if it's good for the painting to be shielded from light, or even if it's good for the tractor to be oiled sometimes. For Singer's theory, these are not interests. They're not morally relevant because they lack the background, which is well-being, and ultimately sentience or consciousness in the phenomenal sense. Singer emphasizes that all beings who have sentience can have interests, And therefore, if interest satisfaction is the goal of morality, we need to include all beings who have interests and therefore who are sentient, who have phenomenal consciousness. And this becomes the criterion for moral status. What's important here is that biology remains irrelevant, according to Singer, when it comes to moral status. It's irrelevant when we consider human beings. We cannot exclude other human beings on the basis of physical disability, for instance. We all understand that the interests of all human beings are equally deserving of our moral focus, irregardless of their biology, their biological differences. And logically, also species lacks moral relevance because it's a biological term. Here, Singer is arguing that we need to be consistent. It is simply so that if we refuse the idea that biological differences influence human beings' moral relevance, why would we use biology to exclude non-human animals? This makes no sense. If we want to be logical, we need to see that species is irrelevant as well. If we, on the other hand, argue that species does matter as a biological quality, this opens the door for many regrettable and morally unjustified isms, such as racism or sexism. If these notions are understood in a biological sense, of course, there are many other ways to these days to define sex and race. But this is Singer's argument. We need to be logical here. We need to consider consistency and thereby refute the idea that biology and species are a reason to exclude other animals. Also, social status is irrelevant. We think that when it comes to human beings, we cannot exclude given categories of humans on the basis of their social status. We must treat everybody's interests equally, regardless of class or religion or other social categories. And logically, this must be applied also to non-human animals, whom human beings often socially categorize into different groups, such as pets or farmed animals or vermin or lab animals. So logically, also non-human animals must be treated according to the type of beings they are, rather than their use category, their social status, which means that pet dogs and lap dogs hold equal value. This is something that Singer is quite adamant on. And finally, the level of intelligence is irrelevant. We do not condone elitism amongst human beings. I cannot say that it is justified for a highly gifted mathematician to eat me because I'm less capable than they are. And similarly, Singer argues that why would our intelligence give us the reason to eat other creatures who are sentient? In fact, I think, isn't it the opposite? If we are so highly intelligent, surely we can understand that it's good for sentient creatures to flourish and live. And we can find other ways of nourishing ourselves. Singer refers to the argument from marginal cases, which comes with certain issues in contemporary discussion. But he argues that small children, mentally disabled, demented elderly, and other groups who do not have the level of intelligence of normal or standard adult human beings, they also have equal moral status. We include all human beings, irregardless of their intelligence, as having morally relevant interests. And logically, therefore, non-human animals cannot be excluded on account of intelligence levels. We cannot exclude non-human animals because we think that they are less intelligent. And I would like to emphasize that, of course, there are difficulties in comparing levels of intelligence between species to begin with. This is highly problematic because evolution is not a ladder. We do not go in one direction. All of the species are not on the same scale, but rather it's a bush or a network, and comparisons are very difficult. How well would a human do in a bat world? We would be quite dumb in a bad world. So why do we think that our type of intelligence is the prototype of intelligence which is needed for moral relevance? And so therefore, again, intelligence seems to be highly relevant when it comes to interests. The only relevant mental ability, according to Singer, is sentience or consciousness. So all sentient creatures must be taken into account. I'll really quickly move on to, well, first I will say, Singer's theory was for many years contested by a number of philosophers. They argued that he simply cannot be right, this is unheard of, what is he saying, we cannot eat meat, this is terrible. But they one after another had to admit that if one believes in utilitarianism, Singer's theory is tight. It's really difficult to argue against. And one of his long-term critics, called Raymond Frey from England, he finally said, after years of trying to object to Singer's theory, he said, okay, Singer is right, I fail. I can't find a mistake in his theory. And this is a common attitude in philosophy. Singer's theory is very well argued for. It's very consistent, it's very logical, if one believes in utilitarianism. And we all do to a certain extent. In everyday morality, I think all of us use utilitarianism too, at least in some contexts. So this is a very logical way to argue for the better treatment of non-human animals. Another theory comes from Tom Regan, which is from deontology. It is not a utilitarian theory, but rather from deontology. And I will really briefly summarize it. He argues that sentience and consciousness not only make our interest relevant, but also render us into individuals with inherent value or rights. So this is a step further from Singer's theory. Singer argues that we need to take interests into account, but Regan argues that we need to take inherent value of other animals into account, and even rights. He speaks of the notion of subject of a life, which is based on the capacity to experience and relate to and act in the world, and argues that all subjects of a life with a given type of a mind have inherent value and rights, and cannot be treated purely instrumentally. I'm really skimming here. This is a very brief, the briefest introduction to Regan's theory that has ever been given, but I'm sorry because there's so little time. But the gist here is that animals can have rights according to some thinkers. Regan believes that animal rights are theoretically and philosophically a sound concept. They lead into or entwine with the respect principle, according to which subjects of a life must be treated respectfully of their life, freedom, well-being, and interests, for instance. So animals come with a whole host of rights, including the right to live. And rights form a moral and legal protection for them, so they are a way of protecting the inherent value of other animals. I hope you are with me still, I'm going so fast, but animals have inherent value and rights protect that value. This is Regan's argument. And he considers the counter-argument that only human beings have a morality and therefore only human beings have rights, and claims, like many others have done, that in fact moral agency renders our responsibility toward other animals more, not less stringent. It would be strange to argue that I am so moral, so therefore I can do what I want to other beings. This is a massive contradiction. It's an oxymoron. So if we are so morally capable, surely we must be able to extend our moral consideration also to other species. I will maybe skip this because there's so little time. So contemporary animal ethics argues that there's a need for a change in our perception of other animals. There's a criticism of mechanomorphia. It requires that we take cognitive capacities of animals seriously into account, and it brings forward animal individuality and even inherent value and rights. All of this limits what can be done to other animals. So these theories and many others, these are just two examples, give us reason to treat other animals with significantly better and wider moral regard. They would come with radical consequences when it comes to, for instance, eating meat. They request that also interests of other animals and also the inherent value are noted in democratic policies and legislations. So all of this is highly relevant to democracy. This gives us reason, these theories give us reason to think that animals must be considered in societal policy and also democratic processes. If they do have relevant interests, if they do have inherent value, if they have rights, the logical consequence is that our democratic systems must pay attention to them. They cannot be excluded anymore. So there is a need to rebuild democracy, and some animal theorists, animal studies theorists, have been indeed arguing that we need to reconsider democratic processes so as to make them more inclusive of other animals. Siobhan O'Sullivan is one example of such a thinker. She argues that current welfare legislations are deeply anthropocentric. They repeat the anthropocentric notion of human supremacy, which I mentioned at the beginning. They're also deeply unjust. And she argues for a need for a fundamental change in legislation concerning other animals. We need a change in animal law in order to consider the animal ethical theories and the consequences. Eva Meyer is a contemporary philosopher who has written a book, When Animals Speak, Toward Interspecies Democracy, which argues for a practical case concerning the inclusion of animals in democratic processes. She argues that we need to rebuild democracy by paying heed to how non-human animals communicate their interests. So we need to start listening to other animals. She doesn't do this in an anthropomorphic sense, but says that there are obvious species differences, but still animals communicate their interests in ways that we can learn more about, and which force us to think about the animal issue when it comes to democracy. And one example is given by John Hadley, an Australian environmental philosopher, who claims that animals have the right to land and habitat. So when, for instance, we cut down a forest, we should first listen to or pay heed to the interests of the animals existing there. And if we do so without this consideration, we are violating a moral norm, a moral principle of the respect principle that I mentioned earlier. We're violating the rights of other animals. And this is quite significant. Animals could have the right to their habitat and land. This would change everything. This really would change everything. And animal politics is the next step from animal ethics. I think that this is a key future inquiry in philosophy. So for you young philosophers, I suggest think outside the box and go towards those issues that are highly relevant in future. Don't repeat the same old theories and studies that have been done hundreds of times, but consider issues and themes and topics which are prominent in society and in the world. This requires imagination. Old theories are deeply anthropocentric often and may not suffice. So for instance, old moral theories or theories of mind tend to be quite anthropocentric. They presume that the human mind is the prototype of a mind, and they often presume that human beings are the prototype of a morally valuable or relevant being. And so the inquiry into animal politics and what could it mean for animals to be included in democracy requires imagination and thinking outside the box. And surely this is what love of wisdom means. We must extend our ability to reason and make our moral vision and moral philosophy much more exclusive of other species. And therefore the question is how to shape our societies and democracies so as to make them more inclusive of other species. And I will leave this question to you, but this is a highly topical, interesting, contemporary issue. It's important. And one of the reasons why it's important is here, and in the previous talk. Treating non-human animals better ensures also human survival. Animal agriculture is one of the greatest causes of both climate crisis and species loss. There is no debate about this. There are a number of very high quality recent surveys and papers on this. Animal agriculture is one of the greatest causes of climate crisis and species loss. So the maltreatment of other animals is causing havoc to the planet, and it will ultimately also have an impact on human beings. So if our species is to flourish, future democracies need to reconsider their animal ethics. This is not only because of other animals, which I myself prioritize. I think that it needs to be done in order to ensure that we treat them better, we treat them with regard to their abilities and viewpoint. But we need to do this also in order to enhance our own survival. And in the era of climate crisis and species loss, this is a highly important topic, thus far marginalized, regrettably marginalized in philosophy. What could it mean to include other animals in democratic processes? I argue that first of all, recognition of non-human minds and value is important here. We need to pay heed to the fact that animals do indeed have minds and cognitive abilities and phenomenal consciousness and some type of moral status that is non-instrumental. Multi-species democracies also require recognition that human and non-human flourishing are intricately interlinked. There is no dualism. There is no human world and animal world. We are part of the same world. Our flourishings are interlinked. Our well-being is, by necessity, completely attached to how well other animals are thriving in this world. And lastly, it requires willingness to pay heed to non-human interests and viewpoints at the level of law, politics, and societal decision-making. And much, much more. I think that this is a truly interesting and pivotal and necessary form of inquiry. What does it need for us to reconsider our democracy so as to include other species and animals? And as I said, I will leave this question to you. And I hope that future philosophers will spend more time with this topic. Thank you.
All right, we have plenty of time for questions, so let's start from there.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, speaking about animal ethics, people still use anthropocentric categories such as consciousness and sentiousness. So, for example, proposed by Peter Singer. And he uses it as a criteria for ethics. And I think that's also an example of anthropocentrism, also speaking of animal ethics, and that's a bit weird. And doesn't it mean we just move the line further, including most human-like animals, but not change our view on non-human animal world as a whole?
That's a very good question. First of all, there's a distinction that is to be made here, which is anthropogenic and anthropocentric. We are anthropogenic in the sense that all that we do comes from us, human beings. We cannot achieve a universal viewpoint, which could then locate completely detached ideas of other animals or anything out in the world. So everything that we do is anthropogenic. Anthropocentrism refers to the idea that only human beings matter and only human qualities have importance and only human flourishing has moral relevance. And these two can be quite different. So I can have anthropogenic concepts because I'm not an alien. I cannot come up with anything else. But I can still try and resist anthropocentric ideas of human supremacy, for instance. Now, whether consciousness and other such qualities are anthropocentric is contested on the grounds that they are rather cow-centric or dog-centric or octopus-centric. meaning that these are shared qualities that seem to be quite relevant to how organisms called animals survive and function and live in this world. So, for instance, phenomenal consciousness has been positioned as a very central mental ability when it comes to the existence of all animal species, and this separates them from plants or inorganic matter. And therefore, I would not use the word anthropocentric here, and I would even turn this around and say that it's anthropocentric to argue that it's anthropocentric to use these concepts, because they're not human only. We do not have ownership of them, but we share them with the rest of the world. Now, as it comes to moral relevance, we again are anthropogenic. We construct value, and I can only make moral conclusions that are based on my own phenomenology and my own biological traits and so forth. And for us human beings, there's something very basic about the value of consciousness. It seems quite immediate to us that, for instance, suffering is a bad thing and joy is a good thing. And the same applies to many non-human animals. So when they are empirically tested whether they would rather suffer or have joy, of course they want to have joy rather than suffering. So even if it anthropogenically comes from me, this idea that consciousness is relevance, there are grounds to argue that other animals would choose the same. They would, if they had our propositional language, they would quite probably say, it matters that I do not suffer, and therefore consciousness matters to me. So there were many small, different answers to your question, but it's a very good question. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you for the lecture. I have two small questions. The first is, are you vegan? And if not, why? And the other one is, which arguments do nowadays anthropocentric philosophers use? In which circumstances they work, and how do you rebound them?
First, yes, I am vegan. I have been vegan for 22 years, and I come from the countryside and from a very rural community. I saw a lot of animal farming and hunting, and I became vegetarian as a child already, and then vegan later on. The other question, I think that these days contemporary philosophers, at least the ones that I know, for instance, in Finland and in many other countries, are quite friendly towards animal ethics. Of course, I don't know what they say when I'm not there, but people are quite interested in this. I would say that philosophers are more likely to be vegetarian than other academics. For instance, in my department, there are many vegans and vegetarians, even if they have nothing to do with animal ethical research. So I think that the attitudes are changing in academia quite rapidly, which is a good thing. But of course, you still find the old anthropocentrics sometimes, and they tend to represent the older generation. But that's a good question.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I find it very interesting. I had a question about the practical applications of these theories. Yeah, so in many cultures around the world, meat eating is still very prevalent. It's a big part of the culture. So how do you think we could replace that? Could maybe artificial meat be a solution in the future? And then I have a second question about animal testing. So I think we can all agree that for cosmetic reasons, this is very unethical. But when it comes to medicine, for example, how could we replace it to benefit both humans and animals?
Mm-hmm. Good questions. When it comes to meat eating, I think that it would be good if people were to understand that even cutting down, eating less has a positive effect. That's a positive thing. So even though I am vegan myself, I think that as societies, the change is gradual, and any change for the better direction is good. How to convince people? Moral psychology is needed in here. The reason why I study moral psychology stems from the fact that after doing years of moral theory, for instance, my PhD was only on moral theory and on meta-ethics in relation to animal issues, and most of my articles from early years were based on that. I discovered that many people will say to me, that's logical, but I still remain unconvinced. I'm not persuaded. I know that what you said is consistent, is theoretically persuasive, but it's not practically persuasive. And I got interested in this issue of practical persuasion and realized that moral psychology influences human thinking and decision-making and attitude to a much greater extent than usually recognized in philosophy. So we can create all sorts of theories, but people won't listen if they remain on a moral psychological level unpersuaded. And here, for instance, emotions play a significant role. Studies show that empathy towards animals is significant. Also identity, ideologies related to identity, which are sometimes and quite often culture-based, they have a significant role. And most of all, issues such as cognitive dissonance and dissociation from the source of the food play a significant role, as do various biases. The list, in fact, is quite long, but I think that more attention needs to be focused on moral psychology if we want to understand how and why we treat other animals the way we do. And I think philosophy has a lot to give to this field, because the empirical studies often remain conceptually hollow, and so philosophical moral psychology in relation to the environment and other animals is definitely needed. In regards to experimentation, Singer was motivated by experimentation in his Animal Liberation. It was one of the reasons why he wrote it. And one of the current arguments is that animal models produce less adequate knowledge than could be gained from other methods, because a mouse is not a human being. So it would be better for also human health if we had more alternatives. And I think artificial intelligence and other big technological innovations will improve the situation. And of course, lab cultured meat is a good thing.
Thank you for the lecture. I think you made clear that from a utilitarian perspective, the dichotomy of the moral dichotomy of human versus non-human animals is hard to justify. My question would be whether this dichotomy would still apply in a contractualist ethics, because you cannot, or at least it is hard to make a contract with the animal or to make promises to animals.
Good question. Behind Rawls's veil of ignorance, we know that we are rational and we are moral. But this, of course, excludes also, for instance, disabled people. And he recognizes in a footnote that the treatment of disabled people, cognitively disabled people, requires compassion that is not based on justice but compassion, which many theorists have seen as a big problem in his theory, and proposed that behind the veil of ignorance, when we consider what sort of norms and rules the society would have, we should not know anything about ourselves. We should only presume that we should do a hypothetical thought play and think that we can be reborn into anything. And what would we want in that circumstance? And Mark Rowland is one philosopher who has argued this. So he has written a couple of books on contractual ethics and animal ethics. And he argues precisely that behind the veil of ignorance, we should consider all species, all animal species. We could consider anything, of course. We could consider what is it like to be a rock, but because it's nothing like to be a rock, it's irrelevant from a moral viewpoint. If I was to be a rock suddenly, I wouldn't mind what happens to me. So there would be no I. It would be impossible. So the limit is drawn in the animal world, and particularly to sentient and conscious animals. But very good question.
More questions?
Hello, thank you. I wanted to ask you how in countries where the economy is based in cattle raisal and exploitation, we can make a practical multi-species democracy. And because in some they're trying to replace it with soybean plantation, but that's also like they're burning a lot of lands to do that. That is also not beneficial for the climate change. So I don't know how we can like make a practical multi-species democracy in countries where yes, the economy depends on animals.
An excellent question. About 1 billion of people on Earth, directly or mostly indirectly, dealing with animal agriculture. And this is something that needs to be considered in animal ethics much more broadly, and also particularly in animal politics. One argument is that we could replace the food production easily with plant production. It doesn't need soya or such things. We can come up with all sorts of inventions, and this is required for climate crisis tackling in any case. And at the forefront of this reflection are not philosophers but climate scientists. And I have read many interesting papers where they argue that we need to cut down animal agriculture and then recognize that 1 billion people are somehow involved in it and what to do. And their solution is to bring out new forms of food production which are technologically innovative and also capable of offering the poor countries more decent wages and so forth. So I think that unfortunately the most interesting thinking on this front happens amongst climate scientists. But again, I think philosophers should take part in this and reconsider it. We know that we need about 1/10 of land if we were to eat plant-based foods, because production of meat protein is so expensive, resource expensive. So we would have less deforestation. We would not need to clear out the Amazon anymore. Poor countries would have much more of their nature present, which they could then perhaps use in tourism or whatever way of advancing their economies. So there are plenty of options, but these need to be thought about, and it's a very good question.
Okay, one more question.
Can speciesism be applied between animals, i.e., in Singer's view, would it be speciesist to value the life of an elephant over the life of an ant?
For an animal to do that?
Would it be an example of speciesism in general to value one animal's life over the life of another animal?
Yes. So Singer precisely when he talks about the irrelevance of social status, this is what he means. We cannot favor, for instance, companion animals at the expense of others. But then other animal ethicists point out to the importance of, for instance, moral psychology. When it comes to extreme situations where we need to choose between two, the so-called lifeboat situations, it is understandable to prefer your family, for instance. And this does not mean that if you were to kick out the stranger from the lifeboat, a human stranger, that some human strangers have less moral value than your family members. And equally, when it comes to non-human animals, in an extreme situation, we can have biases, but this does not signify or imply that there's a universal categorical difference among their value. These are just based on moral psychological necessities. It's a good question. It's a very good question, in fact. Yeah.
Actually, I think we still have time for one more question, so I'm over to the back.
Okay, so would the end result of animal rights directly result in the rights of them being directly equivalent to humans? Or is it going to be catered specifically to animals? And if the latter was chosen, would that mean that it's diminishing their status? Because I think there's a lot of intricacies to it, especially in regards to if animals had an equal standing to us, that would also mean potentially the end goal of animal ethics being unlocking things like allowing them to vote or allowing them to transition, or like just examples off the top of my head, but yeah.
That's a good question. In animal ethics, that's called the argument from absurdity, and it's a relevant argument. What would it mean for other animals to have, for instance, legal rights? Would they have the right to vote? And the answer is no. We would only recognize rights of animals that are relevant to their species, and which they are capable of. When it comes to active rights, which they are capable of also perhaps undergoing themselves. So therefore, animals cannot vote, and it would be nonsensical, it would be absurd to think that we should give them the vote. But they have many passive rights, for instance, the right to life, which perhaps makes also sense to them. And so yes, the argument is that we need to be species specific here and look at the cognitive abilities of the animals. And also when it comes to equality, Singer argues that all animals are equal, that non-human animals are on the same level as human beings, but that there are differences in interests which are species specific. So animals do not have the same interests. My rescue dogs do not have the interest to do philosophy. I do not have to, or maybe they do, who knows, maybe they're at home now doing philosophy, but I do not have to recognize their interest to such activities or their right to religion or whatever. And so Singer also brings this species-specific criterion into the play. But it's a very good question, and also I think that part of the future consideration in animal ethics would be how to make a democracy where let's say 2 million different animal species and trillions of animal individuals are recognized in a species-specific way. But I think there's something worth doing. I think that we need to consider them, but there are lots of practical questions to consider here.
Okay, please join me in thanking Elisa Aaltola.
Thank you.